Last week, we began to look at this book of Ruth, that it was written as a voice of protest against what Ezra and Nehemiah were doing, taken from Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 23:3, it says that no Moabite will ever be a part of God's people, forever. And the book of Ruth was written as a consideration to how Ezra and Nehemiah were applying this. Ezra and Nehemiah, they created an aggressive requirement that Hebrew men were going to divorce. If you had Moabite spouses over the years, you're going to divorce them, you're going to leave your Moabite wives, and you're going to exile your wives along with your own children. So here's a story of protest. We see that Ruth, a Moabite, is being equated in faith and experience with Abraham. Talk about a counter perspective. Ezra and Nehemiah are telling people that we decided long ago, and we are renewing the decision, that no Moabite will ever be a part of God's people. Yet the author of Ruth not only dares to challenge that, but the author of Ruth places a Moabite. And not only a Moabite, but a Moabite woman in a patriarchal society. Places a Moabite woman into the shoes of Israel's most beloved patriarch. Not only is the author claiming Moabites can be a part of God's people, but I will elevate one of their women to stand beside Abraham. Can you imagine the risk that this author is taking? And we considered last week that the author of Ruth may very well be a woman. We may have a female author who wrote or authored the story of Ruth. So when we read the book of Ruth, it's very possible we are reading one book in our sacred scripture, perhaps the only book in our sacred scriptures that has been authored by a woman. Whoever the author is, though, the book is written in 450 BC, as Ezra and Nehemiah are leading a violent religion and a violent nationalism in the name of holiness and purity to destroy families, to banish Moabite wives and children, and to cast out now unwanted women, single mothers, into an oppressively patriarchal world, and ripping children away from their biological fathers in the name of God. As Ezra and Nehemiah lead this decision, it is evident that some are not in agreement. Can you imagine the emotion of this moment? And among the onlookers, there are dissenters thinking, someone has to be the voice of reason. I'm watching this. Someone has to say something. Someone has to do something. And someone does. Just like Jesus. This someone does not meet violence with violence, though. Rather, they tell a mind and heart-changing story. The story of Ruth. They tell a love story. We began this love story with a decoder. And the decoder let us see how the author was using different names to teach us different things. So we began this story with this decoder, and we began the story full of hope. We find Naomi and her small family. They are starving from a famine. Yet Naomi considers herself full. Despite having a famine, Naomi says, I left full. Because as long as she has her family with her, she's okay. And this family, they're forced from Bethlehem, the house of food, because there is no food in the house of food. And they go find life and love among the Moabites. Something God's own people are not giving the Moabites as they're kicking them out under the guidance of Ezra and Nehemiah. If you had one Moabite ancestor 10 generations ago, making you less than 1% Moabite, the law of Deuteronomy said that you would not be welcome or fed in Israel. But 100% full-blooded Israelites go to Moab and they find themselves fed. They find love. So Naomi's family goes and they find a place to live in Moab. And yet tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies. But the author keeps hope alive. As he read that Naomi was left with her 2 sons, there is hope. And the sons, they find love in the land of Moab, and hope remains. Grandchildren can be expected. But then one son dies. This was foreshadowed. Another son dies. This was foreshadowed because the sons are named sickly and frail. There are no grandchildren. And the author tells us that Naomi is now left without her husband and without her children. Naomi is now left without hope. Hope has died. Of the family unit that left Bethlehem 10 years ago, the family that filled Naomi even when she was starving, they're all dead but Naomi. And Naomi returns to where our story first started, and along the way, she releases her daughters-in-law to go back to their original homes with her blessings. And Orpah does. And we shouldn't think anything less of Orpah for doing this. There's no bad or evil choice here. Orpah makes a wise choice. And the last we see of her is she's walking into blessings. And all we can see is the nape of her neck as she walks away. That's the name, Orpah, nape. But Ruth decides to stick it out. And Ruth makes the friendship choice. Ruth, the Moabite, is showing loyalty and love that will preserve the family she is married into. Even after her direct spouse is dead, there are no kids to demand a continued blood connection with Naomi, and she has been offered a release to go. Ruth has 0 visible demands for her to keep this now 2-person family unit together. But she is a friend. Her name means friendship. And she has a heart of love. And she will not leave her mother-in-law. Meanwhile, Ezra and Nehemiah, they have visible reasons that are not present in Ruth's story. Reasons that call for the preservation of family and the love of Moabites, a living spouse, flesh and blood children, the obligation of marriage commitments rather than a blessing to leave. But Ezra and Nehemiah are demanding the destruction of family units. Can you see the seeds that are being sown by the author here? In an eloquent, subversive love story, the author is showing the Moabites and Ruth, the Moabite, to be better at living out friendship and God's love than the Israelites. Even when all the Israelites have all the supporting factors that are no longer present in Ruth's life, the Israelites are still not living it out. So Ruth accompanies Naomi back to Bethlehem. But Naomi, whose name means pleasant, she tells her friends, my name is no longer pleasant. My name is bitter. My name is Mara, for I am empty. I am empty. It's ironic. She had no food when she left Bethlehem, but she was full, and now she comes back to the house of food because there is food, and now she's empty. And here ends perhaps one of the most powerful chapters in the Bible. Because we get to see what Naomi doesn't see. The story isn't over. The powerful lesson of Naomi in chapter 1 is to not presume in the worst moments of your life, in pain. Don't presume the story has come to a close yet. Don't presume the story's over. Naomi doesn't know that there's still 3 more chapters to be told. And as they did with character names, the author foreshadows what is ahead. And they close chapter 1 with a cliffhanger in Ruth 1:22. My paraphrase. While Naomi returned to Bethlehem, believing it was the winter of her life. She had come into spring, the fruitful new life, time of harvest season. And this brings us to chapter 2. Ruth the Moabite has come to a foreign land. She is the ultimate outsider who the law of Moses says has no chance for a home among God's people or even simply goodwill from them. Deuteronomy 23:6 says that you will not even work for the goodwill of the Moabites. I mentioned last week that widows had it very hard in ancient society. The widows, along with the orphans and foreigners, they reflected the most marginalized and vulnerable in ancient societies. Widows lived day to day on scraps. They were at the bottom of the social pecking order. But God's prophets understood that the justice of God was centered on the care of widows and orphans. God's justice is first and foremost uplifting of the vulnerable and the marginalized. God's prophets understood that his justice is provisionary before we ever consider that his justice might be punitive. So to this end, Israel had a system of what we call gleaning. Leviticus 19, verses 9 through 10 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." In other words, when you harvest, you do not get a second chance to pick up the bits of what may have been accidentally dropped or missed. You don't get a second chance. Also, you purposefully leave the edges of your field untouched. Even the law says, if you forget an entire bundle of grain in your field, they would go through and they would take it like a scythe. They would hack down the grain and it would fall, and they would pick them up into bundles and they would tie them and stand the bundle up. And then they would go back through and they'd collect the bundles. If you forget a bundle that was finished and done, you don't get to go back. That bundle stays for those who need it. All of this it's left to provide for your poor, your marginalized neighbors, and to sustain the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners. So in come our two widows into Bethlehem. They have nothing, but they arrive at harvest time. This means that they will at least not starve. They can go to the fields and they can glean the barley. Ruth is the younger and the more able. She can work more ably than Naomi. And she offers to go to the fields and glean for both of them. This is the way they'll have something to eat. And when she goes out to the fields on her first day, it just so happens, simply by coincidence, that she stumbles upon the field of Boaz. We have a new character, Boaz. Now his name, it means pillar or strength. One of the two pillars in front of Solomon's temple was called Boaz. So here's Boaz. He's a successful man in life. He's in a strong position as a bit of an older man. He's had a chance to become a landowner, wealthy, establish himself. The name Boaz means pillar, and you might say that Boaz was a pillar of his community. And he's single. There's the key to the story. What a coincidence that Ruth somehow found her way to his field. In verse 3 of the NRSV that I have printed out there, it says, it just happened that she came to his field. How odd. But see, here's the cool thing about coincidence. Here's the cool thing is that as we live our lives, very often, what is happenstance versus providence is not clear. But just as Naomi gets a few more chapters into her story and she realizes through backwards reflection, she learns, that wasn't the end of my story. There was more to it. Just like Naomi can reflect backwards, it is upon backwards reflection that what is either coincidence or providence comes into greater clarity. I get to look back and begin to put the trail together of where God has been at work with me and guiding me, and I get to see where the hand of God worked. Our eloquent author in this amazing story chooses her unique Hebrew to draw the readers into this problem. She uses ambiguous Hebrew that can mean coincidence, or it can refer to good fortune by the master hand of God. It's ambiguous. And so you're left in the story going, oh, Ruth just so happened into the field. Or did she? We don't know yet. To figure it out, we have to read on. But this is how the author pulls you into the story. So here comes Ruth to glean barley. And by coincidence, for now, she comes into the field of Boaz, a great, strong pillar of a man who is single. As Ruth is gleaning, Boaz comes to check up on things. Can you picture Boaz's personality type? He isn't a micromanager. Harvesting began hours ago, as soon as it was light enough to work. The sun hadn't even come over the horizon yet, and work had begun. But Boaz tended to other things that morning because he trusted those who worked for him. He didn't micromanage them. He let them go out and begin their work. But he also did not get to be where he was by sitting around as a spoiled rich man, detached, doing nothing, and not having his finger on the pulse of his workers. So he comes down to see his employees, to show that he cares about them and the work that they're doing, and to check on the whole operation. And he probably pitches in with the work. What we'll find in chapter 3 is that Boaz works and sweats with his crew. Boaz is the epitome of a seasoned, mature leader who's not above getting his hands dirty, but also doesn't stick his fingers into everybody's business and micromanage them. So here he comes. Here comes Boaz out to his field, and first he greets his lowest employees, the manual laborers, what the NRSV calls the reapers. These would be the actual harvesters. He doesn't ignore them and simply walk past them as if they don't matter. He greets them in chapter 2, verse 4. He greets the reapers, the manual laborers, and he says, "The Lord be with you." And they happily respond to their boss, who is great to work with. "The Lord bless you." Only after first recognizing the least does Boaz then go stand with his manager. He takes the chance then to stand beside his manager and survey everything. He reviews the progress of the harvest, calculating how much is left to go. As he surveys, his attention is drawn to a particularly beautiful woman out there. And he asks his manager, "Hey, who's that?" Specifically, he asks the question, what family does she come from? Reading between the lines, because clans are important, I like her. Whose family is she a part of? Whose family would I be joining with if I married her? You can imagine Boaz's manager, the response in chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. "Oh, her. That is the Moabite." In other words, boss, It isn't even a question about what family she comes from. It is about what nation she comes from. Of all the women that could catch your eye, boss, you choose the Moabite. How many Moabites do we have in Bethlehem? And you choose the one. You choose the Moabite. This is the one who came back with Naomi from Moab. But you know, boss, she came out this morning and she asked to glean from our fields. And you know me, boss, I have a soft heart. And I couldn't even turn away a Moabite. And I have to admit, boss, her work ethic is amazing. She has been keeping up with the men and has not stopped gleaning since they began this morning. But seriously, boss? Of all the women, the Moabite? And he probably turns to look at his boss and go, are you sane? But by the time he turns to look at Boaz, Boaz isn't even there. He isn't there to hear his manager finish his concerns. Because as soon as he learns that Ruth was the Moabite daughter-in-law to Naomi, he's heading over to talk to her. And when the manager finishes what he's saying and looks over to where Boaz was standing, Boaz is gone, walking towards Ruth. And in chapter 2, verse 8, Boaz comes to Ruth. Hello. My name is Boaz. This is my field. And I'm pretty glad you're gleaning here. In fact, and here comes Boaz, about to shoot his shot. I'm glad you are here. In fact, I would like to see you here again every day. You don't need to go to anyone else's field during this harvest. Just come to my field. He went for it. And he sweetens the deal to be her protector. Because you see, Ruth she's vulnerable as a gleaner, as a widow, and as a Moabite. Young men are out in the field, and there's a danger of them harassing women, even taking a woman off into the tall grain and having their way with them. It's dangerous for a woman. It's even more dangerous for Ruth the Moabite. If she's harassed or assaulted, who's going to believe the word of a Moabite against an Israelite man? But Boaz is going to protect her. He lets her know, I'd like to see you every day in my field. And I have warned the men working with me that they will not touch you, or else they and their family will never work in this town again. Also, I have let them know that you have full access to the drinking water that they carry up here every day for my employees. So you can feel safe and you can feel free to drink as much water as you need to take care of yourself. Ruth is left stunned. Why would you act this way towards me? A foreigner, a Moabite. And Boaz responds, because I see you for the person that you are. Moabite, Shmoabite. I see you for the person that you are, the friend you were to Naomi, the personal qualities you have of loyalty and sacrifice and honor. You have left all that you knew to come to a place you did not know. These are the words to Abraham. This is what was said of Abraham. We are seeing a Moabite continuing to be put in Abraham's shoes, and a woman. So Boaz sees her for the person that she is. And Boaz says, I pray that the full reward from Yahweh will be experienced by you, Ruth the Moabite, under whose wings and into whose assembly you have come and found refuge. So noon comes, and lunch is brought out. This lunch is not for the gleaners. It's not for Ruth or anyone else picking up whatever scraps they can find. At its lowest level, the lunch is for the manual workers, the harvesters, the reapers. At the next level, it's for the managers. The next one's up. And at the highest level, it is, of course, for Boaz. So Ruth doesn't even come over to try to eat. Her status does not warrant lunch. She is a penniless tag-along, grabbing scraps from a field. So Ruth keeps gleaning while they serve lunch. But Boaz calls to her and says, come on over here. Probably I'd like to have some time to talk to you a little more. So you can imagine how awkward this is for Ruth as she comes over. The other gleaners, what's so special about her? She's a Moabite. What is going on? And Boaz is like, come on over here. So she comes over to where lunch is being served, and verse 14 tells us, she respectfully, she shyly sits by the reapers, the harvesters, the manual laborers, the lowest at the lunch table. You can probably then imagine she places herself by the lowest. She knows her place. She's hesitant. And her lack of confidence would probably lead her to take the smallest servings per her social and economic status. She doesn't even deserve to be at this table, let alone think that she can be gluttonous and eat. So she takes a little of this and a little of that. But Boaz is having none of it. And we read that Boaz heaps her plate full of food. And Ruth eats until she is full and she has leftovers to take home. Would you look at that? Would you look at Bethlehem? From not enough food 10 years ago to more than they can eat now. And Boaz, in his generous theology of God, is praying for full rewards and piling up the blessings of God to a Moabite. The same blood that Ezra and Nehemiah are saying can have no part of this. After lunch, Ruth goes back to glean, and Boaz talks to his guys. Come over here. I got some other stuff to talk to you about. Remember, guys, no one bothers her. You let her drink all the water she wants. And now one more thing. She gets to essentially glean from wherever she wants. If she wants to grab a bit of barley from the bundles that you have already prepared, let her grab it. In fact, verse 16, in fact, don't even make her work to get everything she needs from there. I just want you guys to take handfuls out of the bundles that you're working with and chuck it out there for her. Just drop it here, drop it there. Make it as easy as possible for her. I got to impress her. As chapter 2 closes, evening comes. Ruth heads home, and Naomi is shocked to see how much Ruth gleaned from the field. But for Naomi to eat, she is still going to have to take some of it and prepare it and cook it. But no. Ruth pulls out the already cooked leftovers and gives them to Naomi. And Naomi is in shock. What is this? Leftovers from lunch. Yeah, they called me over to eat with them. And they sent me home with leftovers. Naomi's eating on the leftovers. And she asked Ruth, where the heck did you go to glean? And Ruth, I just went to the fields. I guess I was gleaning from some field from a guy named Boaz. And Naomi about chokes on her leftovers. And she says, blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken the living or the dead. Boaz is closely related to my dead husband. And there's this whole thing in my culture about redemption by a relative. And Boaz might just be it. Salvation may have just come to our house this day. But that's jumping ahead to chapter 3. For now, we close chapter 2 today. Hope has returned. And Naomi and Ruth spend 4 months through the barley harvest and then through the wheat harvest. 4 months in Boaz's fields, waiting to see what hope will bring. We will only have to spend a week before we get to the next chapter. But they spend 4 months with hope. The story of Ruth it's cloaked as a love story. But at its core, the story about how an outsider, more specifically a Moabite, the ultimate outsider, finds God's wings to be a place of refuge. And finds God's wings to be a place under which there is a table set for her to eat. And the invitation is to all, to even the Moabites. And this is the God who has been fully, completely, correctively revealed in the life and death of Jesus. The connection between Boaz and Jesus has not gone unnoticed through centuries of Bible reading. Jesus is our Boaz, who sees us out there like Ruth, looking for scraps, digging around for just enough to sustain us. And Jesus, like Boaz, says, hey, get over here. I have set the table. And 12 years ago, like Ruth, I came timidly to the table. I sat in the back row of church because I knew my social status. I've mentioned in the past, one of my favorite quotes is this: in other religions, people have to set the table for their gods. But in Christianity, God has set the table for his people. So Jesus calls us to the table. And there I sat 12 years ago, timidly, like Ruth. And Jesus, our Boaz, says, no. When you come to my table, you do not timidly sit there and pick at this. You will eat in heaps. I will heap your plate full. You will eat of my life. And it is abundant life. There is more than enough to fill you up, and there will be leftovers for you to take to others.